You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by
Josh Fairchild.
Hey, Josh. How are you doing?
I'm doing great tonight. I don't have a Han Solo cup here. I have a cup full of chicken broth because I was feeling a little under the weather this morning.
Well, it's better than I think that's probably better than to have you and a chicken broth than Han Solo. I mean, I love Han Solo. Don't get me wrong, but it's good to have you here. It's been a long time, I think, since we chatted. I think I was on the Transit Matters podcast a couple of years ago, several years ago now.
I think it was the Snowmageddon winter of 2015. Actually,
wow.
Pretty sure that's
6
when you
years.
joined us.
Wow, It's been a long time.
I think we've had a few phone calls since then, but yeah.
Yeah, but on a show, right?
Right.
What have you been up to since then?
Transit Matters has grown. I've had 2 more kids, and I've switched jobs a few times.
Those are all good things, right?
Yeah. Well, Transit Matters is no longer a volunteer organization. I think back then there was just a few of us board members and a few hangers-on, and now we've got a full-time executive director and probably 6 part-time employees.
And you're writing reports and you're changing things up there. It's really cool.
Well, we're trying. Yeah. I mean, these are big changes. So increments are a big deal. But yeah, we had 2 reports out in the last week.
How do you put 2 reports out in 1 week? Are they connected?
We did. Well, some of these, they're on the shelf for a while. You know, it takes a long time to percolate. And then sometimes things happen quickly also. But we had one regional rail electrification report, which is our 9th in a series of reports on regional rail up here. And that was about electrification costs. We feel like we really helped influence the idea that regional rail was adopted by the control board, the last iteration of what we had as a control board here that oversaw the MBTA. And, you know, they endorsed the vision of that. And then we felt like what we need to do is go step by step in all the steps of what needs to happen to make regional rail succeed, aside from just the even line by line reports, things like that. So.
Yeah, that's good. And then also I saw something in Commonwealth today from Jared about the crazy idea to change from trolley buses to battery electric buses, which is, to me, I think that's sacrilege, but as the overhead wire. But,
right.
What's the deal there? What's going on?
Well, and I hope that you would think that, you know, with Muni there, with overhead wire buses.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny that in the current discussion of electrifying bus fleets, people forget that trolley electric, you know, overhead wire buses are still electric. And so we have a small fleet of 100% electric buses that have been running for decades since they were converted from trolleys, from actual, street running trolleys. But, you know, when you don't maintain things, then it feels problematic. And we know that as a country, and we know that as transit systems. We see that happening, unfortunately, like down in Metro last week, things like that. But so the idea is that the first step of electrifying the MBTA fleet is to eliminate the trolley wire fleet that we have and replace it with battery electric buses. You know, the concern that we've had, and we've been working on this for a few years, we've seen it coming. The concern is that not only are the battery electric buses, you know, relatively still unproven. We know that you can't do a 1-for-1 bus replacement because they don't perform as well. But we have winters. They tend to use gas-powered heaters in the winter. So you're actually still having the emissions issues. So what we did was the MBTA, we've been pushing this for a while, and we had a report, I want to say maybe 2 months ago, that we came out with Sierra Club together to talk about battery electric and just electrification of the fleet generally. And saying that, you know, in some places, battery buses are going to be great. In other places, we should be using trolley buses, specifically in-motion charging buses. So they still have a battery, but it's a smaller battery, and they're able to run off the wire. So you kind of basically get the best of both worlds. And so there's variations of that. And so that's what they recommended. And then last week, the MBTA came out with sort of a cost comparison of battery buses to trolley. And there were some things with it that we wanted to point out that we felt, you know, weren't probably accurate towards the kind of newer modern trolley buses you would be buying, which are the in-motion charging buses.
Yeah, I see that a bunch here in San Francisco. The vehicles going off wire a fair amount actually. So that's interesting that that's become kind of an issue. Also, pulling back on the electric fleet to put in diesel generators for heating and cooling. I know, when we were in Montreal for, I think it was a UITP conference, I think they kind of had this demonstration of their bus that had the overhead charger, and it was a kind of a fast charger. I think it was with supercapacitors or something along those lines. But they were talking about how, it can be a problem because they can't have as much of a range when the heater's on in the winter because it's so cold in those areas. So obviously it's not that cold here, but it seems like going back to diesel for anything is kind of insane.
I think just in the national conversation right now, battery everything is really popular. I mean, even for electrification of our regional rail fleet, they're wanting to look at battery options, and there's this idea that we should look at fuel cell options and things like that. And it's kind of like we've got a technology that's been around for 120 years and it still works. It's still the best thing that's out there. So
yeah, and it's so heavy too. Those batteries are heavy, which is crazy. Well, let's talk also about your recent trip to California. Tell me about the fun stuff first, and then maybe not the
right.
fun.
Oh, I forgot about that. I had a note early this morning. I was like, oh, I should retrace my steps to remember the story for Jeff, but because now it's been a while. But yeah, I remember I came out to California because my COVID get back in fitness thing, when I found I had not worked out for like 3 or 6 months or something like that, I decided to get back into running by having a target of a half marathon. And I have a friend that lives in San Francisco and had recently got a vacation place up in Guerneville. So we decided to run a trail half marathon up there, and it was in Mendocino, which thankfully it wasn't Mendocino National Forest. They got shut down
Right.
when I was that week when I went up there, but it was the state forest just up the road from the town of Mendocino. But yeah, so we did that. But when I flew in, that kind of became a whole family vacation because he's a family friend. So we decided to bring the kids in for the weekend. And then we ended up turning it into my Amtrak dream of taking an overnight train from Emeryville to actually to Utah, and we spent some went to Arches and stuff like that. But San Francisco, so you're thinking about this. You've got we left Boston at like 6 a.m, right? Ends up being a 9-hour trip with a layover, or it could be a 7-hour direct. But we got moved from a direct flight to a layover in Detroit or something like that. And so at the point where we land, in the evening or I guess this would have been afternoon in San Francisco, maybe it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The kids at this time have been up for like 12 or 14 hours or something like this, right? And we're all starving because we didn't have time to catch a meal in Detroit when we were switching planes, and just getting the kids, trying to get them from one gate to another is its own thing. So of course I'm saying, well, there's no way. Oh, our rental car, we rented a zip car because we were gonna be taking the train out of Emeryville. So I needed to get from the airport to, and I guess I could have flown to Oakland, but I didn't. So I was needing to get from San Francisco to pick up a car, on the Oakland side, right, on the other side of the bay, because that was going to work out better for catching a morning train when we came back from Northern California, from Mendocino. So, I was like, well, we're not going to take a cab or a Lyft or something all the way from SFO to Oakland. That just seems crazy to me. And I know I think I've taken one before. I think I was there about 6 years ago, and I took a cab, and it was a company card kind of thing. And I took it into the city, and I was just like, couldn't believe how expensive it was. I thought, well, we'll just take BART, because I've taken BART, around. I've taken Muni and BART, and I'm a transit, person. So it was a fiasco. It was a pure fiasco, Jeff. And I emailed you about that, saying this is ridiculous, And I know there's a difference between tourist transit, right, and like an airport transit. Like, it's not the most important problem maybe to solve, for your local transit system. But I also think it's interesting to think about how outsiders see your system, and because it gives you that new set of eyes. It's funny. I was in dental consulting, or I was in dental sales for a very short period of time, and we had a consulting arm to our company. And I went through this whole weekend course, which incidentally was in Portland, and they said, well, the first thing that we do when we're consulting on a dental practice is we have the whole dental staff walk in through the front door of their practice, because they've never done that. They always walk in through the back door, which is the employee entrance, right? And they can never believe that they see their whole practice from a whole new angle because they've never walked in through the front door. And it's just like that, I think, when you're, a tourist. So we go down and we take the air train or whatever, when we get to the BART station there at SFO. That part's fine. So then it's like, okay, we got to buy the media, right? And of course I forgot to bring my Clipper card right? And I was like, ah, I left it in my bedside table with all the other transit cards, you know. So then I was like, okay, so I've got to buy a card for all five of us, right? When thankfully, you know, I've got a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, me and my wife, and we've all got to have Clipper cards. Of course, the 3-year-old is exempt. Now in Boston, kids under 12 are free with adults. And there's this rule that it's supposed to be, you know, 2 kids per adult, but I've never had a single person say, hey, mister, I see you've got like a 3-year-old and then 2, you know, older kids. You better stop it right there. So that's kind of my lens coming into this. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. And I find out that like my 5-year-old has to pay a fare and has to buy I think it's a $5 Clipper card plus the fare. So I think it was a $13 fare maybe, which isn't ridiculous, but a $13, you know, because of the distance based thing, right? You got to figure that out. Which isn't that bad, but so I think it's $13. Maybe it's 10 plus 3 or 5. Anyway, I was like doing the math, and I'm like, the percentage of this fare that is going onto the Clipper card that I will never, you know, perhaps use again, maybe in the next 10 years. And the idea that I had to buy, you know, a pass for, you know, the 5-year-old and the 8-year-old just seemed crazy to me. So we get all that done, right? And we get downstairs, and they're all hungry. My wife's just looking at me like, I thought there was going to be a restaurant between here and the station, you know, she didn't understand. So we go down there, and then I understand, and I know that there is this weird triangle, you know, situation between Millbrae and SFO and downtown, right? Like I get this, seeing people write blogs about the problem, right? I've taken BART from downtown to SFO. I had never taken it downtown from SFO before that. So I'm like, okay, well, we got to make sure we're on the right side. And so everything I'm looking at, the trip planner on not the app, but the mobile version, right? The mobile version of the trip planner, and the signs, they all say you want to take the red line. And I can't remember if they were saying what they were saying, but they were like, take the red line. And so I know what's happening. Well, what pulls up is a car on the red line side of the platform. So on the right side of the platform, red line car pulls up, and then it says, this is a purple train to Millbrae. And I'm like, well, it tells me I have to take a red line train, right, to downtown or whatever. And so we get on, and then we get off, and we're like, is it the right train? Is it the wrong train? Because it's purple, but it's supposed to be red. And I thought, well, that's shame on me for not having done the research, you know, before we got on the plane this morning. But in the moment I was like, and then when we figured it, so we missed one train, and then we get the next one. I had finally sorted it out that this is a purple train, but it's going to go to Millbrae, and it's probably going to become a red line train at that point. You know, I figured that was probably what's happening here. So then at that point, that's when I break the news to my wife that it's like, you know, going to be like an hour trip, you know, to get to the other side of the bay before we're going to get something to eat. So the whole thing, you know, and so we get out, then we find our rental car, and then we, you know, our zip car, and then we go to In-N-Out and introduce the kids to that. But the whole thing was a fiasco. And, you know, it was like shame on me for trying to do something good, for thinking that BART's very own trip planning website would explain it to me in terms that I could understand, not having used the system before, but not having been at that stop before.
I don't know if that's a shame on you. I think that's a shame on the signage, on the, you know, on the system itself and the wayfinding of it all. I mean, I've heard a lot of similar stories to this one. Where people are like, I couldn't deal with it. It was too much. It was overwhelming. The trains are going different directions, and you know, it's going to Millbrae. I went to Millbrae. I came back immediately. You know, those types of things. You know, and as somebody who takes it fairly frequently, and I just kind of know how it works because I've gone through that process for the first time, so I know, you know, many times forward. It's also not super friendly for people that are traveling in groups, which is a little bit frustrating. I mean, it makes it so, you know, if you're paying so much money for a trip to San Francisco or even Oakland, you know, some people are just going to say, well, why didn't I just take an Uber or a cab? Because if it's going to be 6 people or 4 people going the same direction, and it's going to cost each of us like $10 or something like that, then that's a $50. Why not just make a $50 cab ride and hop, you know, go to the curb, raise your hand, somebody comes and they drive you wherever you want to go. It's a little bit counterintuitive. I feel like the folks at Seamless Bay Area, if they're listening, they understand your frustration and are working on it.
I just thought, but a transit advocate cannot figure it out, right?
I know, somebody who really cares.
Who loves to go to different cities and try their transit system.
Yeah. That's and your discussion about the Clipper card is a frustration of mine too, that I'm always going to forget the card for the city that I'm going to. I you can probably see this, but these are all of my cards, right? These are all my transit cards. and I have them from probably about 15 different cities. But if when I leave, and usually I try to put all the cards in my bag so that I won't forget. But eventually it happens to where I get somewhere, I'm like, crap, I'm gonna get a new card. I got to get a new Charlie card. Dang it.
Right. Or it's expired. The Charlie card's expired, right?
Right.
So then you're like, oh, I had $7 on that card from like
Exactly.
2012 or something like that.
Exactly. And you can't transfer it. And then, it's the worst. So
Well, and
I
what
feel for you.
the thing is, it's like parent brain. Like you're trying to pack for yourself and 3 kids, and you've got a hectic week at work, and you're trying to get out the door, and you're because you're going to be gone for a week or whatever, and then you're like, then of course the thing you forgot was the clipper card that you've been saving.
Yeah. My tip for folks too is, not to get off at the BART station from the air train, get off at the international terminal and then walk. It's like 2 steps to the entrance of the BART station. And there you would have found restaurants and things like that.
Oh, so, that's a good tip. That's a good tip.
Yeah. Next time, give me a ring or text me or something and say, hey, what's the deal? And
I should have. Yeah. That was a mid-afternoon. In fact, we had talked about meeting up.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I'm sorry it didn't work out, but
our flights got delayed, and it just the whole thing. It ended up being like 5 o'clock by the time we got to the east side of the bay, and we had to drive a few hours.
Traveling,
but
from
yeah,
the East Coast to the
I think
West
I think it was $10 plus $3 a card for, and I don't know if that is some sort of deal where you can go negative at some point, maybe in the system. I know that the MBTA is adopting we're calling it AFC 2.0, which is Automated Fare Collection 2.0, because our current Charlie card is a 1.0. And that's one of the current debates is what's going to be the required deposit or whatever you put on that card. And I got back from the trip thinking, oh, well, the $3 for a $10 trip just seemed a little much for me, especially when it was times, however many people had to have a card. So I asked somebody that I know is very familiar with it, and they said, well, we're thinking $5 right now. And I was like, that's just obscene. Like that's not friendly for anybody. But there's going to be lots of other ways of paying too. But it is one of those things that I think is a hurdle to using the system.
Right. Yeah. Getting your initial card. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry you had that experience. I feel like, your dentist analogy is really good, because when I come back from overseas and I get on BART, I'm frustrated too, because I'm coming through the front door again. And, I come back from somewhere. We were in Paris in 2019, early 2019, and we flew back from France, and we had just taken the subway to get to the regional rail or whatever to get to the airport or get away from the airport. And it was such an easy experience. And then coming back, you get on, a lot of the trains. I don't know which type of train you got on, but some are new and some are old. You get on the older train and you're just like, ugh, what a dump.
It was one of the older ones, and
this thing's 40 years old.
It was, and I'd been on both there, and it was one of the older ones, and kind of like Munich, kind of like the older, it's got the carpet on the seats, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But and of course, it was like a basically empty train car too, which was a little odd, but this was still kind of COVID times, I think. But then of course there was no eyes on the train, so the kids were just like jumping around with all this like hungry, like we're not on a plane after 9 hours energy.
Yeah.
And we were like, if there was other people in the train car, then the kids would not feel, so uninhibited.
I understand.
Behave this way.
Maybe that's actually good. Maybe maybe that was a little better than being cooped up again in a car.
Well, yeah, exactly. Because then they had to get in the car at the other end of that BART trip, So it's one of those things where I think, personally, I feel like, oh, well, whenever I fly home to Boston, I think it's the easiest thing ever. And of course, our airport is just across the harbor from downtown. And but I don't know how other people see that experience, because I've lived here, so I can't remember not taking transit when I would land. When we land with a family of 5 at like midnight, we do get a cab, because having to do transfers with baggage and kids and all that. But myself, I always find it super easy. But then I had a buddy in town, and we met in the Seaport, which is a direct Silver Line bus ride from Logan Airport to the Seaport. I mean, it's a pretty short trip. And, I asked him, well, how'd you get here? And he, of course, had called an Uber. And he's a very worldly person as far as traveling. And I know that he takes transit, in certain places. But I think people get in sort of that mode, and they call the Uber in. And that's not even the easiest thing to do at Logan. Like the taxi stand is right there. The cabs are already there, ready to go, so it's actually more seamless to get in the cab than it is, but it's actually a free Silver Line bus ride, and it's the same amount of time.
Yeah.
So it's funny to think about how people's decision trees and maybe what seems obvious and what doesn't, when they show.
Yeah, for sure. Well, shall we get started with the news?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, this is episode 99. We're in session. And before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed. 2 great podcasts, 1 great channel. Okay, the news. So here are a few stories that piqued the interest of readers over the last few weeks. The first one, the Pointiest Path. So researchers at MIT have found that when walking, humans don't always navigate along the shortest path, but instead choose the path that keeps their destination in front of them, the pointiest route. The human brain isn't optimized to calculate the shortest path, so it relies on a strategy called vector-based navigation, an adaptation that may have allowed humans to multitask. This was by Ann Trafton in MIT News. What did you take away from this piece?
It's funny because I think every one of these articles I had seen in your emails maybe last week at some point and read the quick synopsis or whatever. And so I had read the synopsis of this before and I thought, okay, whatever. I hadn't even noticed that the examples until I read the full article today, that the examples actually are downtown Boston. And these are trips that I've taken. And I recognize the routes, both the quote unquote shortest routes and the observed routes. And when I really read into it, I thought, this is such an MIT article. They just, what did they say? They said, there's this article down here. The types of navigation is very different from a computer algorithm used by your smartphone or GPS device, which can calculate the shortest route between any 2 points nearly flawlessly based on the map stored in their memory. And then they had observed, they for the people who can't see the picture, haven't read the article, they show 3 routes, and it's in downtown Boston, which very confusing streets. You're constantly faced with this, and people, they said, well, we observed 14,000 people, and of course this is perfect because I don't know if they were half in San Francisco and half in Boston or whatever, but the examples were in Boston. And I thought, I've taken these routes before. And it may be that these 14,000 people taking the wrong route, besides whatever theory we have about pointiest destination or whatever their name is for this, maybe it's the 14,000 people know something about their preferences for something other than the most direct route, which maybe it's that other route sucks. Like maybe, you've got it's a traffic sewer, right? Maybe it smells bad, there's trash, or maybe it's a wind tunnel, there's all these kinds of reasons why we decide to choose a certain route, because we want to enjoy the trip. And that's what walking is about. It's about more than just getting there, right? It's about actually enjoying the journey, especially when you're in a place that has interesting architecture, and there's little pocket parks. And so I thought it was really in one way kind of silly. When I had read the synopsis and not known that it was Boston, I was thinking, oh, this reminds me of when I am backpacking or something, and I'm doing like off-path navigation. I get out the compass and the map, and me and my brother or something like that. We're trying to figure out how to get someplace. Well, when we're doing that, we are doing this. What do they call this stuff here? The Pointiest Path. That's what we do when we're navigating, because we're trying to keep that mountain peak, in sight. And that is more important than a direct route, because we need to keep the thing in sight. And there's also terrain, right? There's thicker and thinner vegetation. There's concerns maybe about wildlife, or maybe we're going to need to like stay near water because we're going to have to fill up. And that's what I was thinking about when I read the first synopsis and not realizing this was a Boston example. And then I thought, all those things are directly analogous to our urban walking experiences. There's other things that are important besides just getting there, because there's, in San Francisco and Boston, there's topography, right? Like the best route, I've been there, and you're going upstairs for what feels like 80 flights,
Yeah.
And then there's places where it's a very narrow street and it's very pleasant. There's sometimes my destination in Boston, the way I get there is chosen because if you're on one side of the street or the other, then the corner presents itself in a different light. And one route seems better based on what side of the street you're on. The side of the street you're on may be because it's a cold day and that side of the street is sunny, or it's a warm day and that side of the street is shady, right? And I was thinking about how Jim Aloisi, one of our board members and a former transportation secretary, we used to do this podcast together, like once a month with Transit Matters. And we would always meet up somewhere on Beacon Hill, and I would walk from my office. And I would always take a different route uphill than I would take downhill. And I would think to myself, why am I taking this route? And I tried it the opposite way. It just didn't feel right. And part of it was the return route was downhill. It was through the Common. It went through a part of downtown Crossing where there was a lot of people watching that was interesting, And it also, I realized it was because my building has doors on 2 different sides. And when I leave my building, I have a certain mentality about which door I exit through. And when I enter the building, or when I'm coming to the building, I think of it differently. So there's this whole spatial orientation that people have when they're embarking on a trip, even when it's a habitual trip, they think, well, that's the door I walk out of the building. And then when I find myself on that side of the building, well, this is the route that makes sense. I don't know, Jeff. I spoke. I had lots of opinions about this article.
Well, you're from Boston, so I'd expect nothing less. For me, I just thought it was an interesting piece from the standpoint of reserving brain power to think about looking forward instead of trying to calculate these routes. And I think that makes sense from an overall standpoint, getting rid of of what we know about MIT and the nerdiness of algorithms, et cetera. But just thinking about walking around the city, I know here in San Francisco, obviously what you said was true too. Is there's a lot of routes that I'll take that avoid going up and over a hill, specifically really steep ones. And actually in my neighborhood, I've actually figured out how to go around a hill because that's how you stay on the flat and narrow and don't have to hike up and down too strenuously. Especially when it's a really hot day. Found out a lot about that specifically during the pandemic. So. I just thought it was really interesting to think about this in a little bit different way. I think as humans, we have a certain way of navigating, and sometimes it has to do with staying close to spaces that make us feel safer. I can't remember who it was, but recently we had somebody on talking about how humans like to hug walls. We like to kind of walk near things that are on the side so that we can feel like we can see everything in front of us and then don't have to worry about what's behind us. So I think that probably has a similar.
What's the purpose of the trip is a big part. Is this a commute trip? Am I trying to catch the train really quickly? Or if it's not, I'm meeting somebody for lunch, then I may not care so much. But I think even my office is like a 2-minute walk from South Station where I come in on the train and exit. And even between South Station and the door of my building, I take different routes coming and going. And it's partly based on, I understand the traffic. It's one-way streets that I'm crossing. And I know where it's best to dodge the gaps in the traffic. I know where I'm most likely to get the walk sign at the right time. I know that I can line up these two ped signals in a row if I'm on this side of the street and I'm ready for that gap, and that's just that lived experience that the app doesn't have because they make the decision fresh every single time, right? I think it's interesting when you see how the algorithms choose a different route based on walking, driving, biking, right, or transit. And I noticed we've had a lot of new bike lanes installed lately. So sometimes the biking route will show you a place where you didn't realize that there was new bike infrastructure, which is kind of cool when you find that in your city. But I noticed a route that I looked at the other day, and I thought, well, I know that route, and that's not actually a possible biking. That's a very steep, gravelly. It's a path on the map, and maybe a mountain bike would be good for it, but the kind of bike that I'm going to be on. So there's also that knowledge that they just don't have in the GTFS, I guess, when the algorithm makes the decision, they only have a certain amount of knowledge.
Yeah. As a somewhat of a direction snob, I guess you would say, there's a lot of times where I'll look at the map and be like, nope, I'm not gonna follow that because I don't agree with it.
I often reject it. I find it a little insulting that the algorithm do, and there's like, here's your 2 or 3 options. And I'm thinking, well, I know that there's like 13 ways I could get there. And what I find is interesting is I would like to know what the difference is in optimization between the first 3 and like the next 7, because you often find that the trip time is like maybe 1 minute difference, right? Like in the 3 they give you, and then but maybe the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th are also 1 or 2 minutes difference. Yeah. And so I find it really interesting, like why we choose those 3 and what are we optimizing for?
And I'm never quite sure, honestly. I guess it's speed, but there's got to be other stuff in there too. All right. Experiment reduces package delivery emissions. So a pilot program to deliver packages by e-bike in Seattle found that each package's emissions were reduced 30%. Emissions counted included the truck trip to the micro hub and deliveries on the bikes in their designated delivery zone. Additionally, researchers found that the traffic was reduced by half as the bikes from the hub served more direct trips. This was by Kristen Toussaint at Fast Company. So this was really interesting. We've had Ann Goodchild from the lab up there in Seattle at University of Washington on the show before to talk about this type of process that they've been working on. But I found this is really interesting, thinking about the reductions from changing to e-bike versus just going all truck. I'm wondering what you're thinking about this.
A lot of opinions on this one too, because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I think that there's also, they mentioned the difference between, there's other externalities, right? There's not just CO2. In our neighborhoods, we care a lot about congestion. And, I've got kids. So it's interesting now that it's like the postal service truck comes maybe twice a day. Like, there's like a package truck, and then there's one, the regular mail truck,
Yep.
which doesn't even drive all the way down the street, right? So there's really one postal service truck a day. There's basically like one UPS truck a day, and there's like 400 Amazon trucks that come down the street. That's a concern because those aren't local people. They're on a mission to deliver the package as fast as they can, and they're not as aware of.
They're following an algorithm.
I think they are. I mean, it's interesting because they did say in the article that the bikes, this is the very first experiment of comparing something that they've
Right.
been, working on for 100 years with vehicle, routing versus the first time we've ever done this with bikes, and we learned a lot of lessons. I think that's really important point to make. But also, like, Amazon, they are following the app, right? But also just the fact that UPS and USPS, they have to boil this down to one trip a day, and especially UPS. I have a sister-in-law who interned at UPS. She's an industrial engineer, and she interned there, and so she got an eye into like how they try to solve that problem of delivering all these packages in one trip. And that's, to me, the thing is it really down to a science if we've got like 100 trips going down my street a day? Like, that doesn't seem quite right to me. It's app based, but we're not really optimizing for the least number of trips, so the vehicle miles traveled. But yeah, I think safety and congestion are really important things. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that why is it that people are having things delivered to their house when, I live in a walkable urban place. I'm 10 minutes from a little town square, and there's 2 corner stores. Many of the things I think that are being delivered, probably somebody within a 10-minute walk could pick them up from a local merchant, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about these UPS drop-off places where sometimes they say, oh, your package, you weren't there, and so you pick it up from this, basically it's typically a C-store, a convenience store around the corner that also serves as a UPS point, right? And I've been thinking, well, why aren't they doing this for Amazon? And they are, like at Whole Foods, I guess there's places they do that. But I'm thinking a lot about that problem about how we can reduce the neighborhood traffic and also have the deliveries made certain times of day to a central point that encourages people to get out and then they're thinking, well, if I'm going to walk to the town square anyway, or the convenience store anyway, I don't need to order that thing to be delivered from, California. It could come from, or China or whatever. I could just go pick it up, and so I was thinking, well, what we should be doing is first of all, the cities we live in should be saying, for all the reasons, like, we're not going to let these trucks in outside of certain hours, the number of trips, and they're not going to be able to go on neighborhood streets. Because I find it funny that neighborhoods get up in arms about Waze. They get up in arms about Waze, people like taking alternate routes to their neighborhood, but we haven't heard quite as much people being up in arms because they also like getting the Amazon package, I think. So it's like, what if the trucks could only go to those central locations in the neighborhood where the neighborhood stores are that were wanting to like patronize businesses anyway and stand them up. And then you could basically say, instead of getting your shipping option, whether you want it like tomorrow, right, or like in 10 days for free, it should be, well, I want it for free and it'll be delivered, to the neighborhood, retail area. And I can walk 10 minutes, or I can pay a little bit more and it'll be delivered to the C store that's like a block away from me. Or I can pay more and a bike delivery guy will deliver it actually to my door. And it'll be a bike delivery guy, and you're paying more because you're actually, paying that person for their time.
Well, that's the question I have for you is like, should we just get rid of the bike delivery altogether in urban spaces? I think in places outside of it, I think it's still always going to be trucks. But in this urban context, in cities, should we just get rid of the bike altogether, the cargo bike, and then make it?
I think we should keep the bike. I think we should get rid of the truck altogether, and I think we should keep the bike, because I think there's people have a lot of good reasons to have door-to-door delivery. They may have mobility problems, and I think that's really important. And sometimes people need something really quick and they need it. Moms can't get out of the house sometimes, or dads, or whoever is at home with their kids. They can't necessarily. I've been in a situation where you've got a sick kid and you can't take the kid with you and you can't go to the pharmacy, and you need like a third person to go to the pharmacy and get something for you. So there's a lot of good reasons, I think, to have the door-to-door delivery, but I think we should pay the real cost of it. And I think that we shouldn't let convenience mean that we let all kinds of different big trucks come down our neighborhood streets.
Yeah, I like this piece, and you mentioned this too at the start. There were a few hiccups, like riders having trouble finding where to park or locking their bikes up every time they delivered a package, which ate up time. Bikes were heavy, so if they were delivering to someone in the middle of the block, they couldn't ride up the curb. They would have to get to the end of the street to get up on the sidewalk. And there's hiccups because there's a situation where these delivery companies have been doing this for, like you said, 100 years. And, this is just the first time it's been happening. So there might be even more optimization that could happen for the e-bikes. I also found it interesting that there was a reduction in VMT overall just from the e-bikes, just because of the pathways that they took. It might be different when you get into a system that's much larger catchment area or multiple catchment areas, and you have a lot more of these e-bikes going around. And depending on the size of the delivery of the package too, I mean, you have some packages where you see these YouTube videos or like TikToks or whatever of this poor little lady who is delivering for FedEx or whatever, and she has to like carry this huge ass package, and so she's kind of like rolling it up the driveway.
Right. Or they're having to cross 4 lanes of traffic because it told them to stop on this side of the street and not that side. Yeah, I think that the bikes, I think that one of the points that they made, I don't remember exactly how they said it, was that, you know, basically because they actually reduced some of the miles. And I think part of it was because the same people are leaving the same location delivering packages, and they get to they know it's not necessarily an algorithm on a computer, but they get to where they know the streets. Like your mailman, mail carrier person knows how to make the rounds in your neighborhood and which gates to go in and out of, and all the little things that they know to optimize their route because they've done it. If your catchment for your bike delivery person is your neighborhood or even your surrounding neighborhood, they're going to get to where they know all those little coinky dinks, you know, about your area, and they're not going to make those mistakes, and they're going to know how to do it. So I think that's a really good, I mean, we've got this point, we've got these distribution centers, and I think, I don't know, the same people are going to the same neighborhoods, or if they're just being sent kind of anywhere in the metro area. But I think that's a big part of it.
All right. You ready for the next one?
Mm-hmm.
Preserving the planet through cities. Liam Young, an architect and production designer, has reimagined how to house people on planet Earth by designing cities that house 10 billion people on just 0.02% of the land. The idea was created more as a critique of our current settlement patterns than as a plan for the future, and a way to show how existing technologies are enough to solve the issue of a warming planet. This was by Nate Berg at Fast Company. Nate's one of our favorites. I thought this was fun just from a kind of a futurist standpoint, thinking about how you could fit 10 billion people. Right now I think we're at 6.5 or something like that, maybe getting close to 7, but fitting 10 billion people on a planet that really is suffering from a loss of biodiversity, suffering from climate change. And if we don't clean up our act pretty quick, it's going to be curtains for us. But I was really fascinated to think about this and looking back on some science fiction and things like that. Some of the ideas that they have are rosy, and some of them are dystopian. So this seems like a more rosy idea, and thinking about how we can do things without waiting for a technological miracle to happen.
Yeah, I thought that you would like this article.
You thought that I would like it?
I did think I thought this was right down Jeff's alley. He's kind of this real thoughtful person about the future of cities and liking to think about urbanity. I know you're a big Star Wars fan.
I am a big Star Wars fan. It made me think of Coruscant for sure.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so that's exactly the first thing I thought about with some of these mock-ups you see in Star Wars. And they do always seem a little dystopian, though, don't they? I mean, they're fantastic. That's what I thought was kind of the thing I initially took. I went and watched his TED Talk because it made me want to watch the movie. And I thought, gee, this is, it made me more thoughtful than opinionated, but it definitely was something where I think the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people when they hear this or see this is going to be, oh, that's dystopian. But what the cool thing about it, which you already mentioned, was that he's not talking about that far into the future. He's talking about when we're at 10 billion people. Was it 2040 or 2050? I mean, it's not unimaginably far in the future.
Yeah, 2050, I think it was.
So yeah, I thought as a thought experiment, it was a cool way to like try to concretely give people ideas, and it made me wonder what the architects and urbanist engineers and city planners and thought leaders in those areas, what they're going to do, what directions they're going to take this and go with it. And the other thing I thought, because I'm kind of a Tolkien nerd myself, and so it made me think of the way he went into the cultures and the costumes that they would wear at the festivals they would have
yeah,
with every neighborhood, because he was like, basically you're gonna reduce the entire world into this like one city, but there's going to be like thousands of neighborhoods. And he was like, we're gonna have all these different festivals. So he was like imagining the costumes they would wear at the parades they would have in the festivals, and I thought that's very Tolkien-esque to like really get into like the mythology and the backstory and what they're wearing and stuff like that. So I thought that was pretty neat.
What was it? He said something about having how to have a fall harvest festival on a crop row that seems uniform, something like that in the article, at least. That's a really interesting thought too. Is going back in those details, thinking how you would have these celebrations. I mean, every city even has a different celebration of things like Halloween, things like their favorite sports teams, whatever else. How would you mesh that if you're going to combine everybody into a city, that takes up so little space? How are you going to combine all of those small things that make places different into one big place? It's an interesting look at maybe the sociology of it all.
I mean, I immediately was thinking, I mean, if you think like conflicts and civil wars are bad now when, people are separated by countries and continents, I mean, it could get really ugly really fast, even if your neighborhood is doing great, which your neighborhood could be, a billion people or whatever.
Right.
But I think that, and the idea of eliminating the nation state, boundary and we're all, I mean, in reality, you were reducing it down to a neighborhood, right? So nations and continents were becoming like, neighborhoods and like, sub areas of the community. But I think the really cool part of it is that we don't see this enough, where he was making the vision so tangible. It wasn't just like the GM city of the future, from the 50s or something like that. Like this was, when you're getting into those details of what they will wear and how they will celebrate, you're having to go to such an extent of being visionary that you're really having to put yourself in that place. And I think that makes the thought experiment more real for all the people who are doing it. And I think it will actually be successful in leading people down a path that will go somewhere, because it's so real and it's so immersive, I guess.
It's such a small amount of space to put that many people in our current kind of understanding of things. Now, if we think about a city like Coruscant in the Star Wars universe, which is the planet city, which is the whole city, it has 50 layers and is there's no nature left on it, and it has to survive based on its imports from other planets. I'm curious how that like works in your mind. Like, what do you see that being a possibility of putting like that many people on 0.2% of the land, 0.02% of the land? Or is it just kind of a fun thought experiment?
Well, I think that they're showing that it's possible. I was doubting the ability to bring all the resources into that small of a place, to do it. And I was trying to think of like how the construction would actually happen, because they're talking about 127 stories high these things are. But I think in politics and everything, we're talking about moving the window when we talk about it in transit and in urbanism and parking battles and all these kind of things. And I think it's one more way of saying, you're concerned. Everybody's saying, well, this isn't New York, or, this isn't London, or whatever people say. And now we can say, well, this isn't Planet City, and so if the window moves that far, then the type of scary density, that we think that, the big cities of North America are, which are not really that dense, on an average basis. I think that becomes more like, oh, okay, I guess it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah, it's not Kowloon Walled City in Hong Kong. All right, so finally, high-speed rail killed Italy's airline. Italy's national airline, Alitalia, I still am not sure how to say that, but Alitalia.
I think that's right.
Will shut down on October 15th, or has shut down on October 15th. The air carrier was once the main connection between northern and southern cities in the country, but now 2/3 of trips that would have been by plane are now by high-speed rail. Because it's easier to travel between city centers on trains than city airports, many believe the death of the national airline is due to a more convenient rail travel. This was Julia Buckley in CNN Travel. It's an interesting kind of case study of, one, an airline making bad decisions, and two, a national railway making some good decisions. But also kind of a look at what would happen if we actually started thinking intelligently about regional rail travel versus kind of the way that we're looking at it now and giving Amtrak a bunch of money just to do what they're doing.
The most surprising thing to me about this article is I thought the conclusion or the premise that high-speed rail killed Alitalia was pretty obvious based on the things that we know, even from kind of crappy high-speed rail in the U.S. And was it TGV celebrated their 40th anniversary last month, and they were talking about how much that changed people's mindset for how you travel there. Because I think one of the trips that they cited in one of the TGV articles I read, and I think it was something like 2.5, or it was under 3 hours for the trip, and I can't remember how many 100 kilometers it was. I looked up the trip by car. I thought, what would that be? And it was something like a 6.5 hour drive.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, of course they're going to take the train. So, but the craziest thing to me was that Alitalia was supposedly a domestically focused air carrier. And I had no clue. I just thought that I don't know if it's part of the Star Alliance or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I just thought, well, clearly they're just bringing people from other countries to Rome and Milan and Venice or whatever, because, I visited Italy in 2008, and we flew into Rome. it never occurred to me that we would fly from there to like Venice or something like that. I thought, well, of course we're gonna take the train, and that was even before, I guess, their high-speed train revolution. So I thought it was interesting that they said, well, of course, like, American tourists, because they're used to flying domestically, they would be the key demographic here. They would of course think that they're going to fly between, Italian cities. And I was like, well, why would they think that? Because when you're in Rome, right, what do? You don't take the plane.
Exactly. Exactly. And I've flown into Milan and then taken a train down to the Cinque Terre before, and it was an interesting experience. Obviously, it wasn't high speed rail; it was regional, and I had to make sure that I stayed awake long enough so I didn't end up in Monaco. But it was a pleasant experience, and it wasn't hard. Just the transfer in Genoa, but other than that, it was pretty easy. And so, I think that they maybe don't give Americans enough credit, at least the traveling ones. But I just think it's just kind of says what we know about smaller countries that are connected by these railways. It's so much easier to go to the center of the city than it is to go out to the airport. I remember, to leave the country, we had to wake up at like 2 or 3 a.m. to get out 2 hours to the Milan airport out in the boondocks. And it was kind of ridiculous. I almost wish I could have taken a train to get there. Instead, we got a taxi driver with a really bad clutch,
Right.
It's messing stuff up. I think that we can learn a lot from this situation. I think a lot of the air carriers in the United States maybe could learn a little bit from this as well. Those air pairs that I think you're alluding to, which is between Boston, New York, Washington D.C. A lot of that's been replaced by travel on the Northeast Corridor. I think here in California, hopefully, when high-speed rail is completed, we'll kind of get rid of some of those air pairs between Los Angeles and San Francisco that take up some. That's maybe one of the first or second largest connections in the country. Houston, Dallas, when that railway is finished. And so I think, when we get there, and this is a process that has happened over many, many years. And the same thing with France too. The 40 years, it didn't just pop up overnight. They made investments over those 40 years, Germany, et cetera. And so I think there's a lesson to be taken from that too, is these regional train lines, these country train lines, it's not like they just popped up. But over time, they took away share from the airlines to the point where they killed the airline. It's not like they just popped up and built one line and were like, okay, we're going to take your share, airline. No, it happened over time, and they built connections, and now they're building tunnels underneath the Alps to get to France. It's a process.
What was interesting, they talked about that basically Alitalia was the fate was sealed when is it Trenitalia? They decided not to merge. I guess they had been talking about a merger.
Yeah.
And Alitalia thought, well, this makes sense, and the train company was like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, why would we? We don't need you.
Yeah.
Because if you're thinking about a merger for domestic travel, like it doesn't. I think I had written down in the margin somewhere, like, basically planes are kind of the enemies of cities. Like planes and cities don't really go together. Planes and like continents or region, you can get from one side of the continent to the other, to a different continent. But if you're trying to get to cities, planes really aren't that ideal. So yeah, you're right about the Acela corridor, the Northeast corridor. I was trying to find the stat real quick because it's a crazy number, but I think it's something like air travel now, which used to have close to like 80% to 90% of the Boston, New York, mode share. It's now like 30%. The stats I found are a little bit questionable, but it did say that Acela had captured 54% of the market, and that was like 5 years ago, just the Acela. So that's not even counting the regional. And the thing is, a lot of people, take the buses too, because and so you're talking about a market where it's basically like 4 to 4.5 hours by car or bus, unless you get stuck in traffic, it could be 6.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about the same on the regional. It's like 3.5 on the Acela. You pay $100 more for that. So the business travelers all do it. But even with like kind of that crappy high speed rail and like equal train to car travel times, they're still taking a huge mode share out, from the plane, and the plane's even faster.
It's pretty crazy to think about people going to the airport and flying between Boston and New York. And
well, in Boston, you got to remember Logan Airport is basically downtown in Boston.
Yeah, but the New York airports aren't.
But New York is not,
York.
right? So I mean, you just imagine what the mode share would be, if Boston's airport was as far away as it is when you land, at Kennedy or whatever. So
it also makes me wonder what some of these other larger airlines are gonna have to do in the future when this, and even in Europe. I mean, in France, Air France cannot compete with airline that's under 2.5 hours. If there's a 2.5 hour trip or less, you have to take high speed rail because the climate change laws prohibit that. And so I'm interested, in the future, what happens to KLM, what happens to, Air France, what happens to British Airways, because a lot of their trips now, and this has kind of been, I think, a place where Etihad and some of these other larger carriers have taken over because they're taking these long distance trips, not necessarily the short distance ones, which are being taken by local high speed rail or local rail lines, especially in Europe. So I'd be interested to see how those airlines kind of last, because there's probably a survival of the fittest going on, and some of them are probably going to go by the wayside at some point.
I would think so. I mean, I thought when I read this about Italy, because I was like, well, what's the land area comparison? Because I was like, it'd be almost like if New England had like their own airline for intra New England travel. And we do have Cape Air, which basically specializes in taking, wealthy people to the Cape and the islands, and to Bar Harbor and New York City. And it's a very kind of specialized service, and they have very small planes, and they're very expensive tickets. So, in that model, like, they survive.
Yeah. Well, all right. This week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month, and you'll get some stickers, and $10 a month, and you'll get a bus-only scarf. The bus-only scarves, if you order them now, you can probably get them before Christmas or before it gets cold. I know in some places it hasn't even gotten cold yet. Thank you, climate change. Listener questions and comments. I don't have a question or comment this week, but if you want to email us, you can do so at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. Puppies and butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in other sections. Do you have a puppies and butterflies, Josh?
I do, yeah. So
Awesome.
I bought a cargo bike this weekend.
Nice.
I don't know a lot about the cargo bike brands, but I was trolling Craigslist for months, figuring out how to do this, because the prices are just crazy on brand new like e-assist, family cargo bikes. But I snagged one this weekend on Craigslist, and now we have to do the e-assist conversion, because I promptly I rode that like 7 miles to take a kid from where I picked it up to a soccer game, and then another 5 miles brought two other kids back, two of the other siblings back, and I just had to take a nap. I was done for the day, and 12 miles on a road bike wouldn't phase you, but 12 miles is like any kind of incline is horrible.
It's pretty rough,
So
huh?
we're gonna do the e-assist next, but still,
How do you retrofit? Do you have to, like, is there a kit or something that goes on? Or?
Yeah, you can, I was looking at one of the videos of one of the conversion kits, which is actually the same brand, I think, as it's Nihola. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. It's a Dutch company. But you basically pull out, the where the pedal is, the crank, and you insert like the motor, and it has its own crank insert and its own pedals that go into it. And it's a pedal assist as opposed to a hub assist. And I don't know a lot about it, but it seemed pretty straightforward. But so I'm, looking for whoever wants to help me do that and figure out how to do it. But that's pretty cool. And then, Halloween's coming up, right? So
that's right. Do you have all their
kids are
costumes for the
kids? Have their costumes, and our neighborhood has a cool Halloween tradition. People, kind of do kind of a march, parade almost around the neighborhood, going to all the houses, and then everybody gathers, down the block by the basketball court where the gathering area is, and they have drinks and stuff like that. And last year it was a little, subdued, obviously.
Yeah. Maybe it'll be back to a little bit more glory this year, I imagine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who stays home? Do you stay home, or does your wife stay home? How does that work in terms of like taking the kids out? Because you have to give out candy at home, right? Or you
do, yeah. But I think because of the way we kind of do it, where the kids all kind of go around as a troop, then there's kind of designated parents that go with them, and it's not a big area,
right?
So it doesn't seem, people kind of say, oh, I'm gonna run back and tend to the candy jar now. And a lot of people just leave the candy jars, on a chair, and it says, please take one, or however many you want. But
yeah. Oh man, I did that. Well, so I when I was younger, I decided that I was going to sit outside and kind of keep an eye on the candy, but I did it. I dressed up as a scarecrow, and I sat down in a chair and I put the candy on my lap, and I had a sign on my chest that said "Take one." And so the kids that didn't take one, I jumped up and scared them. And I had one kid that flipped over backwards on the lawn.
Did you have a camera? You recorded that?
No, it was so many years ago. It was like 1996, 1997 maybe. So this is pre-cameras. But I don't think I would probably do that again because it might be a little cruel, but it was at the time I thought it was a good
Yeah.
idea.
Well, we used to where we had a condo before. We the first year we didn't realize we were like in Halloween Highway right there, and I mean it was like hundreds of kids would come through, and we ran out of our candy in like 30 minutes.
Oh yeah.
It was crazy. And then definitely there were kids that would come in. And I grew up with this, where you would drive to a certain neighborhood that was good for candy. But here they would like take the bus or whatever, and kids were coming off the bus and they had the school backpacks, and these are some of the older kids. They would turn them around and put them on their front, and they would just like open up the backpack, like throw the candy.
You have that a little bit here, like a block away on Fair Oaks. It's pretty, you get probably a few thousand kids come through, and I think they must go to Costco and just buy sacks and sacks of candy because there's just so many kids. But they don't necessarily come down our street, it's good and bad. It's bad because I don't get to see all the kids in their costumes, and that's super fun. But it's probably good because then I don't have to go to Costco and buy a huge sack of candy, and then you have the leftover candy too.
Well,
so.
that right, isn't that the thing, right?
Yeah, and I as I get older, the less and less that I'm okay with the leftover candy. I used to be okay with it, but now maybe not so much.
I think we still have Dum Dums from like 3 years ago. They just never.
the stuff the kids aren't as excited about, maybe. Well, Josh, where can folks find you online?
They can search for me. I'm not really on Facebook. I have like a dummy account there, but I haven't been on there in a long time. Twitter, hatchback31 is my handle.
And then Transit Matters as well. You can find
Transit Matters. Yeah, you can find me. You can get in touch with me at Transit Matters too.
Awesome. Well, you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at theoverheadwire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous Patreons for sponsoring this week's podcast. Thanks to Josh for coming on the show and for bearing through the California adventure that he had. And we'll see you next time.
Talking